We left off last time with the firing on Fort Sumter, Lincoln's call for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion, and the Upper South seceding. In this lecture, we're going to start the actual fighting of the Civil War, and we're going to cover the years 1861 and 1862. Now, before we look at the first battle, I want to look at the strengths and the weaknesses of both sides. And I'm going to refer to the North and the Union as the one side, and the South and the Confederacy as the other side. Now, the first thing we want to look at is population. In this, the Union had the advantage. There were 31 million Americans in 1860. 22 million lived in the states that remained in the Union. 9 million lived in the Confederacy. Now, of the 9 million people in the South, 5.5 million are white Southerners and 3.5 million are black slaves. So on the one hand, the Confederacy has even more of a disadvantage in men of military age because of slavery. But on the other hand, slavery allowed a higher percentage of Southern men to fight for the Confederacy because slavery released them from many forms of labor. Slaves would grow food, haul military supplies, and dig trenches and fortifications, and that would contribute to the Confederate war effort. Now, another thing to take into consideration is that many men in the Union states go and fight for the Confederacy, and many men in the Confederacy go and fight for the Union. So when everything is said and done, the North had an advantage in manpower of 5-2. Now, as the Union armies advance into the Confederacy, many slaves will run away from their masters. This will weaken the Confederate war effort while at the same time strengthening the Union war effort. So keep that in mind. Now, when we look at the economic strength, we see that the Union also has the advantage. The Union had more manufacturing establishments and factory workers than the Confederacy did, and that's what they used to turn out the implements of modern warfare, things like rifled muskets, artillery, railroads, ships, wagons, food, etc. In all, the Union had about 110,000 manufacturing establishments or factories, while the Confederacy had only 18,000. The Union also had more railroad than the Confederacy, 22,000 miles to 9,000 miles. The North also has more horses and mules, which is how armies in the 19th century move and carry their supplies. Now, the writer Shelby Foote has made this argument that the Confederacy never had a chance of winning, and that's an idea echoed by many other historians. Shelby Foote's a writer who wrote a great trilogy on the Civil War called The Civil War Narrative, and Shelby Foote says this: "I think that the North fought that war with one hand behind its back." And then he goes on to say that if the Confederacy ever had come close to winning on the battlefield, the North simply would have brought out that other arm from behind its back. I don't think the South ever had a chance to win that war. And like I said, a lot of people agree with that sentiment. Now, this is true in the sense that if the North and South were determined to fight to the last man standing, the North had more resources and probably would have won the war anyways. But the victor in war is not always determined by the side with the most men and material. Sometimes war is decided by who has the will to fight the longest. The American Revolution and the Vietnam War are great examples of this. In both wars, the side with the larger population and the greater military machine lost to the weaker side because the weaker side had a stronger will to fight. So it's totally possible that the Confederacy could have won the Civil War by winning enough battles in order to make the Northern public feel that the war wasn't worth it, and the North should just let the South go and become its own nation. Now, another advantage the Union had is that it started the war with a professional army and navy. Though they were both small, those wishing to fight for the Confederacy had to resign the army or navy and then go join the Confederacy. Those fighting for the Union just had to stay put. The Confederacy had to establish a civilian and military hierarchy when the war started. Now, there's an argument about who had the better president, the Union or the Confederacy. Many historians believe that Abraham Lincoln turned out to be the better wartime president, although on paper Jefferson Davis had a much more accomplished career. Davis had been a hero in the Mexican War. He had been Secretary of War under Franklin Pierce. He had also been an accomplished United States Senator. Lincoln, on the other hand, was a lawyer who had served in the Black Hawk War in the 1830s and as a one-term representative in the House. Though Lincoln would make many mistakes, he also made important decisions that helped tip the outcome of the war towards the Union, towards Union victory, while Davis made some critical mistakes that hurt the Confederacy's chances of winning. One way to think of it is that it could be argued that Lincoln's lack of experience enabled him to be more flexible and shift strategy as the war went on, while Davis's abundance of experience caused him to be rigid and inflexible. Now, the Confederacy had a number of advantages. The Confederacy did not have to win the war, they just had to not lose the war. The Confederacy had declared themselves a nation, and the Union had to defeat them in order to preserve the Union. The Confederates also had many geographical advantages. The Confederacy was fighting on their home territory. That means they would know the terrain and they would have a friendly population surrounding them. It also meant that they would literally be fighting for their homes. If the North lost the war, Union soldiers could just go back home, which their homes would be undisturbed by the war. But if the South lost the war, Confederate soldiers might not actually have a home to go back to. And also, the size of the Confederacy was an advantage. The South was enormous. It was over 750,000 square miles, which to many seemed an impossible area for Union armies to conquer. It also had 3,500 miles of coastline and numerous harbors through which the Confederacy could move military supplies. Some rivers were a toss-up as to whether they would be an advantage or a disadvantage. Some rivers would turn out to be advantageous for Union armies. The Mississippi River and then the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers supported the Union because they were oriented north and south, and they could be used as avenues of invasion for the Union armies with their gunboats. Other rivers, like those in Virginia, were oriented east and west, and therefore might block Union armies coming overland from Washington to Richmond. However, if the Union armies came from Washington to Richmond by way of boats, they could land their forces on the tips of the peninsulas in Virginia and then use the rivers to supply their troops as they marched west towards Richmond. Now, there's also some areas that can be considered neither advantages or disadvantages for either side. For example, both sides would have officers that had been trained at West Point, where they had learned the same tactics. Both sides would have officers that had fought in the Mexican War and learned the same military lessons from that war. Now, there's this myth that the South had better military generals, but not enough fighting men or material, and that the North had more incompetent military generals, but more than enough men and material to wear the Confederacy down. For the first part of the war, the Confederacy did seem to have better generals in the Eastern Theater. However, during the war, the Union had better generals in the Western Theater. After the Union more or less won the war in the West, Ulysses S. Grant came east and fought Robert E. Lee, at which point the generalship was more or less equal in the Eastern Theater. There was also the question of how Europe would respond to the Civil War. Would Great Britain, France, or both step in to help one side or the other? Both Britain and France were against slavery, which means they might help the North by staying out of the conflict. But Great Britain and France also needed Southern cotton to fuel their textile industries, which meant they might help the South. People on both sides of the Civil War were aware that this intervention could tip the scales of how the war turned out. Now, there was a big advantage that was up for grabs in 1861, and that was the border states of Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, and then West Virginia. Ultimately, they would remain in the Union, but there was no guarantee of this in 1861. These states had large populations, lots of resources, and important geographical positions that could tilt the war in either direction. Now, Delaware is a very small state. It only had a few hundred slaves, so we don't really need to talk about it. But on the other hand, Maryland was much more important because between the states of Maryland and Virginia was Washington, D.C., the capital of the Union. If Maryland seceded, then the Union capital would be located in the Confederacy and it would be cut off from the North. To prevent this, Lincoln acted very aggressively in Maryland. He used the Union military there. He arrested Confederate sympathizers. He arrested over a dozen Maryland state legislators. He sent Union soldiers to polling places to ensure the victory of Unionist candidates in state elections. These actions helped keep Maryland in the Union. Kentucky was also a very important state. Kentucky had a large population and lots of animals that were needed for 19th century armies. Kentucky also had the Ohio River on its northern border. If Kentucky joined the Confederacy, then they would have the Ohio River as a defensible boundary that the Union armies would have to cross. Kentucky Governor Beriah Magoffin was pro-Confederate, and when the Civil War started, he issued a proclamation of neutrality. Though many men and materials for the Confederacy were being moved through Kentucky, Lincoln respected Kentucky's neutrality. He stated that in the upcoming struggle, he would like to have God on the Union side, but he must have Kentucky. Ultimately, the Confederates violated Kentucky's neutrality in September 1861, and then the pro-Union state legislature appealed to the Union armies to drive out the Confederate forces, and Kentucky was firmly in the Union camp. Missouri was also a very important state. Border ruffians in Missouri had been traveling into Kansas and fighting during the 1850s, so when the Civil War started, pro-Confederate militias started to form in the state. They had their headquarters in St. Louis at a place called Camp Jackson. Now, Union General Nathaniel Lyon was tasked with kind of keeping the state in the Union column. He disguised himself as a farm woman delivering eggs so he could go spy on the Confederate forces at Camp Jackson. And then in May of 1861, he led Union troops and forced the Confederates at Camp Jackson to surrender. Later that fall, at the Battle of Wilson's Creek in August 1861, the Confederates defeated a Union force there. Nathaniel Lyon was killed in the battle. However, the Confederates were unsuccessful in their follow-up campaign to retake Missouri, and later in the fall, 1861, Missouri becomes strongly in the Union camp. Although Kentucky and Missouri remained in the Union camp, there was a rival government in each state that declared its allegiance to the Confederacy and, in essence, seceded. The Confederacy put a star in their flag for each state. So the Confederate flag had 13 stars, 11 for the original seceding states, and then 1 for Kentucky and 1 for Missouri. Now, the last border state wasn't a border state when the war started. West Virginia is a section of Virginia that did not agree with secession. So when the state of Virginia seceded, the people of Western Virginia decided to secede from the state of Virginia. So they put this plan in motion, and then in 1863 they were recognized as their own state, and they were admitted as the state of West Virginia in 1863 as a free state. Now let's talk about military strategy for a minute. The basic goal of the Confederacy was to defend their nation from conquest. This is very similar to what the colonists had to do during the American Revolution. During the American Revolution, George Washington had carried out a strategy of attrition. Basically, that's the strategy of winning by not losing, of winning by wearing down a superior enemy. Some argue that the Confederacy could have won the war if Jefferson Davis had pursued this sort of policy, but he did not do this for a couple of reasons. First off, the Confederate public demanded that the entire South be defended from invasion by Union armies. In the American Revolution, Washington was willing to give up territory to the British in order to escape with the Continental Army and live to fight another day. The Confederates in 1861 would not have stood for this. And the other reason, the people of the Confederacy just believed that they were better than people of the Union. There was kind of this idea that that one rebel could whip 10 Yankees, so why not meet them in battle? Don't run away. So as a result, Davis pursued what has been called a cordon defense strategy. This is basically a strategy of dispersing his forces across the entire Confederate border in order to prevent an invasion by Union armies. Now, Confederate strategy eventually evolved into something called an offensive-defensive strategy. Basically, the Confederate armies would defend their territory by using interior lines to concentrate dispersed forces against Union armies. But if the opportunity arose, they would leave the defensive and go on the offense, and we'll see that a couple times. Now, Union military strategy revolved around General Winfield Scott's Anaconda Plan. General Scott was the most accomplished military man in America. He was a Virginian who remained loyal to the Union when the Civil War started. When the war started, he was 75 years old and 350 pounds, so he's very far past his prime. Now, the Anaconda Plan had three phases. First, it called for a joint Army-naval operation that would push down the Mississippi River and cut the Confederacy in two. Second, it called for a Union blockade of the Confederate coast, which would prevent war supplies from Europe reaching the Confederacy. And third, it called for a Union army to invade the heartland of the Confederacy. Scott estimated that this army would be 300,000 men, and it would take 2 to 3 years to conquer the Confederacy. Now, there's lots of different armies and there's lots of different generals in the Civil War. There's too many to list here. As we kind of go throughout these lectures, you'll get to know a few of them. But I do want to familiarize you with the main theaters of war and the main armies and generals in the war. There's basically three theaters of war: the Eastern Theater, the Western Theater, and the Trans-Mississippi Theater. We're going to focus mostly on the Eastern and Western Theater. That's where the Civil War is fought and won. Now, each side had numerous armies. Union armies tended to be named after rivers, while Confederate armies tended to be named after the states that they fought in. The most important Union armies are the Army of the Potomac. That's the most important army in the Eastern Theater. And then the Army of the Tennessee, which was the most important Union army in the Western Theater. The most important Confederate armies are the armies of Northern Virginia. That's the most important one in the Eastern Theater. And then the Army of Mississippi, later called the Army of Tennessee. That's the most important Confederate army in the Western Theater. And like I said, there's lots of famous generals. As we kind of go through this, you'll get to know who they are. Okay, so let's get into some battles. The first major battle of the Civil War was called the Battle of First Manassas, or the First Battle of Bull Run. Manassas was the rail junction where the battle took place, and that's the Confederate name for the battle. Bull Run was a creek located near the battle, and that's the Union name for the battle. Now, many in the North wanted a quick victory, and there was a lot of pressure on Lincoln to do something. The New York Tribune, which is a popular newspaper in New York, they ran an editorial in July of 1861 called On to Richmond. This called for the Union forces to march to Richmond before the Confederate Congress could meet there and to just bring a quick end to the war. The idea is that let's just get this Civil War over with. It'll take one big battle. We'll whip the rebels, and then they'll realize secession was a mistake and the war will be over. So that's the Union plan. So in the summer of 1861, forces are put into motion that lead to this first battle. General Irving McDowell was the Union general in charge in Washington. He had about 35,000 men, with another 18,000 men in the Shenandoah Valley under General Robert Patterson. He was ordered to move against the Confederate Army at Manassas Junction, which is just 30 miles away. The Confederate Army was commanded by General P.G.T. Beauregard. He had about 20,000 men at Manassas Junction, with another 12,000 in the Shenandoah Valley under General Joseph E. Johnston. Both McDowell and Beauregard planned to attack each other and turn the other's flank. McDowell ordered Patterson to keep Johnston and the Confederate soldiers under him occupied in the valley so that they could not reinforce Beauregard at Manassas. Now, McDowell's army set out for Manassas Junction from Washington in mid-July, and on July 21st, 1861, the two sides met in battle. McDowell's forces attacked first, and they hit the Confederate left flank. The Union side was winning throughout most of the day, but the Confederates in the Shenandoah Valley managed to slip away from the Union forces there, and they came via the railroads to the battle, reinforcing Beauregard's forces at Manassas Junction at a very important time. Now, during the Union attack, a famous stand was made by Confederate General Thomas Jonathan Jackson on the Henry House Hill. The Union soldiers advanced, and Jackson and his men made a stand. One Confederate general saw Jackson and his men making this stand, and he said, "There stands Jackson like a stone wall. Rally on the Virginians." After that, Jackson's known as Stonewall Jackson for the rest of the war. The Confederate forces held, and then they counterattacked and turned the tide of battle and drove the Union soldiers off the field. The Union soldiers retreated, and this retreat turned into a panicked rout, and they fled back to Washington in something called the Great Skedaddle. Citizens and congressmen from Washington had come out to watch the battle, and the retreating Union soldiers overran them as they picnicked. One congressman even was captured by Confederate forces. Now, the Confederates did not follow up the attack, but many Southerners felt the battle showed that one Confederate was worth 10 Yankees. Now, the casualties shocked Americans. On each side totaled, there were about 4,800 casualties, so when you add up both sides. Now, not much else happened for the rest of 1861. There were battles, but no major ones. Heavy fighting, however, would commence in the first part of 1862. Now, Union armies undertook a major offensive in the first 6 months of 1862 in the Western Theater. Out west, General Henry W. Halleck was in charge of the Union forces, and under his command, the Union plan called for an offensive down the Mississippi River and an offensive into Tennessee. Confederate forces in the West were under the command of General Albert Sidney Johnston. He was considered by many to be the best soldier in the Confederacy. His goal was to carry out the cordon strategy, defending the borders of the Confederacy from Union penetration. He had a huge territory to defend, and to do so, he dispersed his forces in a wide arc across his territory. The Confederate left flank was located at Columbus, Kentucky. The Confederate middle was located at two important forts, Henry and Donelson, on the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers, and then the Confederate right was located at Bowling Green, Kentucky. To carry out the Union offensive, General Halleck tasked Ulysses S. Grant with commanding the expedition into Tennessee along the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers. In late January 1862, Grant's forces traveled into Tennessee to break the middle of the Confederate line. He did so with the help of ironclad and timber-clad gunboats commanded by Flag Officer Andrew H. Foote. The Union armies in the West had a number of river gunboats to help their armies conquer the Confederacy. These ironclad gunboats were designed by a man named Samuel Pooke, and the soldiers called these gunboats Pooke's Turtles because they kind of looked like turtles in the rivers. These ships were about 175 feet long, and they had slanted armor on them. They had 13 guns and were powered by steam engines. And in February, Grant captured the Confederate forts of Henry and Donelson. When he captured Donelson, he was asked what terms of surrender he required for the fort, and he replied, "Unconditional surrender." And from that point on, Grant's nickname was Unconditional Surrender Grant because his nickname, or his initials, are U.S. Grant, Unconditional Surrender. Now, these victories by Grant, when joined with other Union victories, caused the Confederates to abandon their defensive line and withdraw their forces from Tennessee, and they reconcentrated in Corinth, Mississippi. Nashville, the most important city in Tennessee, fell in late February 1862 to Union forces. Now, with much of Tennessee under Union control, Union armies then marched towards Mississippi. The Confederate forces gathered there, and they planned a counterattack. This counterattack was devised by P.G.T. Beauregard, and this resulting battle was the Battle of Shiloh, which occurred on April 6th and 7th. It was one of the biggest battles of the Civil War. On the first day of the battle, the Confederate attack was successful, and it almost drove the Union Army into the Tennessee River. Grant had been taken by surprise and as a result almost lost the battle. But during the successful attack on the first day, Confederate General Albert Sidney Johnston was killed, and this left Beauregard in charge of the Confederate armies. On the second day of battle, Grant was reinforced by Union General Don Carlos Buell, who had been making his way from Nashville with his large Union army. The Union armies then counterattacked and drove the Confederates out of Tennessee and back into Mississippi. Casualties were very high. The Union forces suffered 13,000 casualties, and the Confederate forces suffered 11,000 casualties, so 23,000 total casualties on these 2 days of fighting. These numbers shocked the nation and made the nation aware that this would not be a quick war. It was going to be a long and bloody war. Now, the Union armies had more victories in mid-1862. At the end of April, New Orleans fell to Admiral David G. Farragut, and the city was occupied by General Benjamin F. Butler. New Orleans was the largest city in the Confederacy with 160,000 people. In early June 1862, after a massive naval battle on the Mississippi River, the city of Memphis fell to Union forces. So basically, from January to June 1862, Union forces have been very successful out west. Important Confederate cities have fallen, such as Nashville, New Orleans, and Memphis. The Confederates can no longer use all of the Mississippi River to move their goods, either abroad or within the Confederacy. Although the Union does not yet control all of the river, men and material from the Trans-Mississippi Theater can still be shipped across the Mississippi River into the rest of the Confederacy. Much of Tennessee is under Union control, so in essence you have the first conquest of a Confederate state. The Confederates pulled back to Corinth, and then they abandon it, and Union forces move into Corinth, Mississippi. This leaves the road open for the invasion deeper into the Confederacy. And then Albert Sidney Johnston, who many considered the best Confederate general, had been killed out west. Now, while Union armies are advancing in the west, Union armies in the east undertake a major offensive against Richmond. After the failures at Bull Run, General George B. McClellan replaced Irving McDowell, and he's put in charge of all the Union forces in the East. General Winfield Scott retired in November of 1861, so McClellan becomes both general-in-chief, meaning commander of all the Union forces, and specifically the commander of the Army of the Potomac, so he's the field commander for that army. He was a young general. He's 34 years old. He's brilliant. He's very cocky, and he's very good at organizing armies. McClellan did not like Lincoln. He openly despised him, and he would call him names in public. He would call him a guerrilla a lot of times. One time, Lincoln and Secretary of State William Seward came to McClellan's home to talk strategy with him. McClellan hadn't been home, so they waited for him in his parlor. But when McClellan did get home, he went upstairs and went to bed and told his servant to tell the president and the Secretary of State to come back at another time. So he's very dismissive of Lincoln. Now, his flaws as a general, he always felt he was outnumbered by the enemy, and he was too cautious to move. The historian Robert Lucky wrote this of McClellan: "Like a historian who will not write his book until he has read every last word in his subject, fearing to be criticized as incomplete, and thus writes nothing, George McClellan just had to be sure before risking defeat." Another way of putting it is that McClellan was always so proud of the army he created that he didn't want to break it in battle. Despite his arrogance, he's a superb organizer of armies, and he did instill confidence in the men of the Army of the Potomac after their defeat at Bull Run. He spent months forging a mighty fighting force, and in the spring of 1862, he undertook something called the Peninsula Campaign. In late March, the campaign began. He took over 100,000 men via water down to the Virginia Peninsula and then attempted to march up to Richmond. He moved very slowly, however, towards Richmond. He was bogged down at the tip of the peninsula in a siege at Yorktown. When the Confederates finally left and Union forces moved forward, they found lots of Quaker guns in the abandoned Confederate fortifications. A Quaker gun is just like a tree log that's painted to look like a cannon, so it looks like your enemy's defenses are more formidable than they are. So McClellan gets duped during the siege of Yorktown. While the Peninsula Campaign is going on March 8th and 9th, history is made in the Civil War when the first ironclads fight a battle. The Confederate Virginia battled the Union Monitor for hours. They fought each other to a draw. Neither side could pierce the army of the other, but they forever changed naval warfare. No longer would wooden boats be very useful. Now it would be iron ships. Now, by June, McClellan is outside Richmond, and in a fierce two-day battle called the Battle of Seven Pines or Fair Oaks, the Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston is wounded in the defense of Richmond. This leads to General Robert E. Lee being given command of the Army of Northern Virginia, and in a series of battles known as the 7 Days Battles from June 25th to July 1st, Lee attacks McClellan with his 85,000 men, and he drives him away from Richmond. One reason Lee won these battles is because he was a very audacious commander. Another reason was because of Stonewall Jackson's Shenandoah Valley campaign. From March to June, Stonewall Jackson had kept 3 Union generals busy in the Shenandoah Valley, which prevented them from reinforcing McClellan in front of Richmond. Jackson then gave the Union armies the slip and made his way to Richmond, where he helped Lee in the 7 Days battles that drove McClellan away from Richmond. Another famous general, the leader of the Confederate cavalry, Jeb Stuart, he had conducted a famous ride around McClellan's entire army in June, and he had gathered reconnaissance and taken a number of Union soldiers prisoner. Now, the casualties for the 7 Days battles were enormous. Combined casualties over those 7 days were 36,000. This is just unheard of in American history. Now, the Confederates are not out of the woods yet. Lee may have saved Richmond, but McClellan is still on the peninsula with over 100,000 men, but Lee has turned the momentum over to the Confederate side. After these initial Union advances in the first part of 1862, the tide shifts and the Confederacy goes on the offensive in the latter part of 1862. Lee starts to move his Confederate army north, and in August 1862 they fought the Second Battle of Manassas against Union General John Pope. Lee and Jackson and James Longstreet, another important Confederate general, win a great victory there. Again, the casualties are very high, 24,000 total casualties. Pope's army retreats back into Washington, and George B. McClellan, who had been recalled from the Virginia Peninsula, is called upon once again to lead the Army of the Potomac against Lee. After Second Manassas, Lee invades Maryland in late 1862. Lee had a number of reasons for invading the North. Most of the war so far has been fought on Virginia's soil, so Lee wants to give Virginia a break. He also wants to let his army live off of the land of the North for a while. Lee also wants to take the initiative. He's a very bold general, and he feels that boldness will make up for his weakness in terms of the number of men and material he has. Lee also hopes that if his army invades the North, it would help the Democrats in the fall 1862 elections. There's also this belief among many in the South that Maryland is not really a Unionist state. They believe Maryland was being held in the Union against its will, and perhaps the Confederate army on her soil will kind of liberate her. Finally, the Confederate army, if they could successfully invade the North and win some battles, Europe might be willing to recognize the South as a nation. Perhaps they'll intervene, perhaps they'll mediate, perhaps Europe will break the Union blockade. Now, Lee's Army of Northern Virginia crossed the Potomac River in early September 1862. Part of Lee's forces under Stonewall Jackson attack Harper's Ferry, and they capture 12,000 Union soldiers there. While this is going on, McClellan was following behind Lee's army, and he finds Lee's military plans, which were accidentally left behind in Frederick, Maryland. They had been written on some paper that was wrapped around some cigars, which some Union soldiers find. When McClellan reads Lee's war plans, he boasts, "Here's the paper with which, if I cannot whip Bobby Lee, I will be willing to go home." Now, despite knowing exactly what Lee's plans were, McClellan moves very cautiously. This caution on the part of McClellan allowed Lee to gather his army together at a town called Sharpsburg near a creek named Antietam. He concentrates his forces, and there on September 17th, 1862, the single bloodiest day of the Civil War takes place at the Battle of Antietam. Lee had about 35,000 men versus McClellan's 80,000 men. In a battle that lasted throughout the day, Union and Confederate forces attacked each other just outside Sharpsburg. More than 23,000 casualties happened that day. Lee remains on the battlefield, so it's not really a Union victory, but eventually Lee has to retreat back into Virginia, not having achieved his goals, so in that sense it is a Union victory. Lincoln is very upset with McClellan for letting Lee get away. By this point, Lincoln has realized that defeating and capturing the enemy's army is what will win the war, not necessarily capturing the enemy's capital. And after the November elections, he removes McClellan from command. The bright spot for the Union is that Lee's driven from the North, and this gives Lincoln an opportunity to issue his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. This declares that all slaves in areas still under Confederate control to be free. The Northern victory at Antietam also caused Europe to hold off on recognizing the Confederacy, something they had been contemplating. Now out west, a major Confederate offensive was taking place under the leadership of Braxton Bragg. This invasion lasted from August to October 1862, and it's an invasion from Tennessee into Kentucky. It would include multiple Confederate forces under Bragg. Bragg's goals are similar to Lee's goals. Let the Confederate armies live off the land a little bit in the North. Bragg wants to get Kentucky to join the Confederacy. They believe that Kentucky was not really a Unionist state. Bragg also wants to recapture areas that are under Union armies. He wants to recapture Tennessee. Now, the climax of this invasion of Kentucky is the Battle of Perryville on October 8th, 1862. Part of Bragg's Army of Mississippi, or Army of Tennessee, fights a part of Don Carlos Buell's Army of the Ohio. This battle turns out to be a stalemate. Neither side really won. But at the end of the battle, Bragg decides that it's been too much of a fight, and he decides to retreat from Kentucky and go back into Tennessee. Now, there's fewer than 10,000 casualties altogether. Bragg ends up achieving none of his goals in the invasion. When he retreats into Tennessee, however, Buell, the Union commander, does not follow him up and does not try to capture or destroy his army. Another battle had taken place just a few days prior to Perryville. The Battle of Corinth took place on October 3rd and 4th. In this battle, a Confederate force had tried to recapture Nashville, but they were defeated, so Nashville is safe in Union hands. So you have two Confederate invasions in the fall of 1862, the invasion of Maryland and the invasion of Kentucky. These invasions both culminate in battles that see the Confederate armies not really defeated, but they end up retreating, and the Union armies don't really follow them up. So that's kind of 1861 and 1862. Next time we'll look at 1863, 1864, and then finally the last year of the war, 1865.